This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Well, hey, everyone. It's Mark Bayer, and you are tuned to When Science Speaks. Thanks so much for being here. Today's episode is brought to you by Bayer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists and engineers get funding, gain influence, and build relationships with the stakeholders who matter most in their professional environment. It is so great to have Russ Harrison on the show today. Russ has 25 years of experience working on behalf of professional societies, companies, and trade associations in Washington, D.C., which he applies to his leadership role as the Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA, the American component of the world's largest technical professional society, which is IEEE, with its nearly 170,000 individual members across the United States. Over his 17-year career with IEEE-USA, Russ has represented IEEE members on dozens of policy issues, including autonomous vehicles, digital privacy, AI, federal research funding, export control, and immigration. In addition to directly engaging with policymakers, Russ strives to build bridges between engineers and politicians. He has spoken at over 260 local, national, and international events about public policy and the need for regular citizens to interact with their elected leaders. Prior to IEEE-USA, Russ represented recycling facilities and the steel industry in D.C. He has a master's in public management from the University of Maryland and a BA in political science from Allegheny College. Russ is a certified association executive and a planning commissioner. Welcome to the show, Russ.
Thank you for having me, Mark. It's a thrill to be here.
You know, as I mentioned in the intro, you've spoken to hundreds of groups of technical professionals across the U.S. and around the world. Mm-hmm. What are some of the common misperceptions about policymaking that you hear consistently from these audiences?
One of the things that comes up, and it comes up in a lot of different versions, but the basic question is, why would we bother? And it's a frustrating question because the answer to me is quite obvious, because you want to make a difference. Mm-hmm. But it comes from a place, these are very cynical times we live in. Mm-hmm. And I think in many ways, society encourages people to be negative. Mm-hmm. And so it is easy for people to simply assert, nothing we do matters, no one will ever listen to us, we're not important, therefore we shouldn't try. Mm-hmm. And the beautiful thing about that approach is that once you take that position, you're done. There's nothing else you need to do because you've already proven that anything you do is irrelevant, and thus you can be lazy. Mm-hmm. And so it's frustrating to me. The fact of the matter is, this is a very big country. It's a very complicated country. The odds of one person having a tremendous influence over what happens in Washington or even in your state capital is relatively small because there's a lot of people here. On the other hand, small groups of very committed people who are dedicated to making a change and getting heard can have tremendous impact on what happens in this country, and in fact, do frequently. And we can, I can cite examples of where IEEE members have engaged policymakers in relatively small ways, consistently over a little while, but still in relatively small ways, and changed history and changed legislation and gotten things passed into law. And so my response to the question, why should I do this? It's not going to matter, is, well, of course it'll matter. You have to do it right, and you have to do it smart, and you have to do it over time. Mm-hmm. But the fact of the matter is, and Mark, you mentioned in the intro, I've been doing this now for a quarter century, which is a very disturbing fact all by itself. But, before that, I have a master's degree in international relations, so I studied other countries and I pay attention to what other countries are doing. I sincerely believe the American political system is the most open and most accessible political system in the world.
Right.
Some of the other democracies are right there with us, but you can't do much better than us if you're willing to put in the effort and speak up. And so I almost always get that question when I speak in a various form or another. Mm-hmm. Why would I bother? And the answer is because that's how you make a difference, and that's how we make things better.
Right. We're the worst system except for all the others.
Exactly.
And, it's interesting to kind of taking what you said, Russ, in a little bit of a related dimension is, with this interaction with policymakers that, as you pointed out, you've been doing for quite a long time. You got a great perspective on that in the U.S. and also abroad. What areas do you think technical professionals, just generally speaking, really need to further develop to be good at it? Of course, the mindset is the first thing you pointed out. You have to feel like my efforts are going to pay off. But then it's like, okay, well, you've convinced me that I can make an impact. Then the question is, well, how do I do that? What qualities, what knowledge, what skills do I need to have to be successful as an advocate?
That's when it starts to get interesting. The first thing, I think scientists and engineers are not any worse at this than most people in terms of taking the first step and engaging. I think all Americans are increasingly pessimistic in a way that's not helpful about our political system. But when you look at the kind of the technical professionals, the engineers, the scientists, I think we collectively need to get much better at embracing the squishy questions in policy. And what I mean by that is we're very good at the technical questions. How do we build an autonomous vehicle? How do we get people to the moon? Those basic technical questions. And, we need to do a better job of communicating those, but that's the easy part. The problem is all of these questions, which appear to be purely technical, and then lots of questions which obviously aren't, none of them are entirely technical. They all have a societal component, a non-technical component that I think scientists and engineers have a tendency to overlook because they don't consider those questions to be important. We want to build an artificial intelligence system. Okay, so the interesting question here is how to build it, how to make it think, how to process data, blah, 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 all the technical questions. The questions about whether you should or not, that's not that, if you want to answer those questions, you became a lawyer, not an engineer.
Right.
So but the thing when we talk about policy is if you ignore those squishy questions, you're missing half the equation. So, for example, a lot of discussion about how to power this country. How do we make sure all Americans have access to adequate electricity? Most urban areas in the United States the demand for electricity is going up. Supply is going up much slower, if at all. In some cases, it's actually declining. And so most urban areas in the United States are approaching a point where they're going to need more electricity or the lights are going to start going out. Okay, so how do we do that? So a question about how to generate the power, that's one set of questions. But you're not going to build a major power plant inside a city because it's too expensive and no one's going to let you. So you're going to build it someplace else. And then you're going to build a really big high voltage power line to connect the power plant to where the people are. Okay. Engineers, geographers, surveyors, whoever else is involved in this process know how to build that power line. They know where it needs to go. They know what it needs to look like. They know what materials to use. So all of those questions they can answer. The problem is at some point in the process, that power line is going to be in somebody's backyard. And that person isn't going to like it. And if you ignore that person or you dismiss their concerns, you're missing the point. For most Americans, their house is the largest financial asset they will ever own.
Right.
And when you build a power line in the backyard or really anywhere near it, the value of that asset drops, which means you have actually hurt them. And they're going to want to do something about it. And that's why it's really hard to build high voltage power lines in the United States because people don't want them in the backyard and they have a reason for it. So when engineers approach this question of how do we power a city, if you don't consider the impact of your actions on regular people, if you just dismiss them and say, well, they're just going to have to get used to it, they're just going to have to deal with it, you're missing the hard part of the equation. And that's true of just about every question that scientists and engineers would tackle in the policy space. There's always those squishy components. And because we don't consider them or because we dismiss them or because we just don't deal with them at all, we miss the ability to really solve the problem. And so I think of all the things, you can talk engineers and scientists need to do better communicating. It's very difficult for anybody to communicate very technical things so that non-technical people can understand them. That's a skill that some technical people have and some non-technical people have, but you need more of it. But I think the real underlying problem when engineers and scientists approach politicians is they assume that these are technical questions, and they're really not.
Yeah, such great points in there, Russ. If I could just draw out a couple of those, because it's so important. Some of the things that you had to say there clearly. Well, first thing, it sort of reminds me of this equity versus efficiency argument. Not really an argument, but maybe dialectic or whatever you want to call it, comparison. The efficiency. Well, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. Well, what happens if that straight line is actually a high voltage line and it goes through my backyard? Well, then it's, I'm not so worried about the shortest point at that juncture, right? I mean, the engineer might tell me, this is most efficient, but from an equity standpoint, it's not. And of course, we've seen, you talk about power plants, we've seen the type of environmental discrimination that occurs, with sewage plants and all these other things being built in neighborhoods where they don't, minority neighborhoods often, where they don't have the ability or, the political power to push back. And they end up, bearing the brunt of health effects that result as a consequence of that. And talking about engineers being able to distill and boil down, I'm really glad that you use the word skill, because not just, and you pointed this out too, it's not just related to the technical professions, scientific professions, but I think that kind of mindset is getting back to the sort of notion of the mindset. Understanding that this is a skill, and that if you want to be a strong advocate, you have to develop, this skill. You have to accept this dynamic as, a skill that you can learn and you can get better at, but that it's not something that just comes intuitively, as you point out, because there is so much information. How do you go about, distilling it? So thanks for drawing that out. Really important points for everyone to remember. I want to, kind of shift a little bit and talk about the assets and the benefits and sort of the intrinsic abilities or perspectives that technical professionals do have in interactions with policymakers and their staffs. And maybe some that they don't even realize they just need to activate.
This is a good question, an important question. And Mark, I want to go back to something you said just a second ago.
Sure.
Push back just a tiny bit. You said that sewage plants, as you said, and other infrastructure things are often built in poor neighborhoods because, as you said, those communities don't have the political strength to stop them. I would say that's not quite true. Those communities don't use their political strength to stop them. But like engineers and scientists who don't speak up, communities that don't speak up get taken advantage of. That's how it works. But to suggest that they can't feeds into the cynicism we were talking about a minute ago. Of course, they could have stopped it. They didn't, because they didn't speak up, because they're not organized, because they didn't know how to play the game. And I'm not blaming them, but I would suggest that they could have if they had fought harder. And I think that's true of most of these policy issues. We could have made a difference if we'd done X, Y, and Z. Right.
Yep.
Which gets to, so the assets we have, again, I think this is important to focus on, because it's whenever I talk about this, I make a point of being very positive about people's ability to affect change, because I believe it. And because if we decide that's not true, there's no point in going on. Engineers, scientists come to the table with a number of very useful skills. They are, generally speaking, very highly regarded in society. They are trusted by society, which makes them valuable to politicians. And they are, generally speaking, trusted by politicians. Politicians don't really trust anybody entirely, which may not be a bad thing. But when an engineer or a scientist comes to them and says, hey, this is what I think, the politician usually will listen a little bit more carefully than to regular Americans, because the assumption is that you're a thoughtful person. And that's usually true. There's a second reason politicians will listen, however, which is engineers and scientists know stuff. And they know stuff that politicians need to know to do a good job. and that politicians, generally speaking, know they need to know to do a good job.
Mm-hmm.
An increasing number of the policy challenges facing our country and our society, and therefore facing our politicians, have a technical or scientific component. I mean, you think of COVID, just about everything about COVID requires scientific understanding. Politicians don't have that understanding. They don't understand viruses. They don't understand ventilators. They don't understand curves and things, which means they have to listen to someone who does. Same thing with artificial intelligence or quantum computing, autonomous vehicles. Politicians know they have a role to play in helping society deal with these technologies. And most politicians also, they won't admit it, but they know they don't really have enough understanding of the underlying technology to get it right.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that IEEE-USA does a lot of in Washington, probably the thing we do more than anything else, is simply educate politicians about technology and what it means and what it can do and what it can't do. And I don't do most of that. I set up the meetings, but I'm not an engineer.
Mm-hmm.
So we bring in engineers to explain technology to policymakers. And it's enormously effective, enormously powerful, and most groups can't do it because most groups don't have the understanding and the knowledge that scientists and engineers have. And I think it's easy to discount that, to say, well, yeah, but we don't have the money, we don't blah, blah, blah. But you really shouldn't. Most policymakers, and again, we need to put aside our cynicism here, most policymakers are actually trying to make the country a better place, trying to make the world a better place. They disagree on how to do that, but they're trying. You have information they need to do that right, and they know it. And so when you go to them and say, hey, listen, I want to explain to you what's really going on here, they are prone to listen. And more so than most groups, I think.
Yeah, well, I was just going to add on that because, when I was on the Hill for all those years, we wanted to hear from the people who are actually doing the work, who it's a firsthand knowledge. You can have someone come in, a lobbyist or an advocate come in and talk about the merits of something, but to actually talk to the engineer, to the scientist who's worked, personally firsthand on this project carries this weight of authority, that you mentioned. And it's so important. So you get that firsthand perspective. Absolutely. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, we did a great set of meetings a couple of years ago that started when a member of the House of Representatives called us up kind of out of the blue, which doesn't happen a lot, but called us up out of the blue and said, it was actually the member's chief of staff. And she said, my boss thinks quantum computing is the next big thing. Mm-hmm. And he thinks it's vital to the United States that we maintain a competitive edge in this field. And he has instructed me to draft legislation to make sure we do that. We said, great, you should do that. And then she said, I don't know what a quantum computer is.
Of course, yeah. You can't be an expert in everything.
Yeah, well, yeah. And there's nothing, she's a very competent woman. She's a very good chief of staff. The legislator she worked for was a fantastic congressman. But no, they can't know everything. And to be honest with you, I work in this field. I only have the dimmest idea what a quantum computer is. It's a computer that uses little tiny weeny things. That's about it for me. Huh. But we brought in some folks that were actually developing quantum computers and sat her down and a couple other staffers from a couple other offices in a back room in August when nobody was around and just let them ask stupid questions. And we answered them, well, not we, but my members answered them best we can. And that kind of education is tremendously valuable and powerful.
Yeah, so true. And, we would have, I would rely on these experts and the staff as well. And yet you would do a meeting like that, and you might then go ahead and have Leg Counsel draft up some language, and then you would call back and say, okay, could you take a look at section 1273? I want to just make sure we got this right, and incorporate comments from the experts. Like, it's such a valuable, key resource to do. And I'm so glad that you guys are focused on, IEEE-USA is really focused on that.
It's really how the political system is supposed to work, really. This is regular citizens who are experts in whatever they're an expert in, telling the politicians how things work and working together to craft good legislation. That's how it's supposed to work.
Right, right. You mentioned also, Russ, COVID, and how, of course, science is essential to understanding what we should all be doing here. And I wanted to just ask you, in your current role, how you're doing advocacy these days, given COVID.
I have to laugh because my members just asked me that. I did a presentation late last week when I tried to answer the question. And I started off that presentation, and we'll start off this answer here by saying I don't really know yet. The rules have changed. I know some of the new rules, but a lot of the new rules haven't been written yet. The fact is that the bread and butter of advocates in Washington and advocates outside of Washington, regular people, is the meeting. Politicians are people. They like to work face-to-face with folks. That's how they tend to think, and that's how they approach the world, and that's perfectly fine, except you can't do that at the moment. And so everybody is kind of floundering around trying to figure out the best way to do that without, doing a face-to-face meeting. We're doing phone calls, which work, but they're not quite as good. You can do video calls sometimes, but staff generally don't like them. What we have found, to be perfectly frank, is that we are doing just fine working with offices that we already have a relationship with, but reaching out to legislators and staff that we don't know yet is very, very hard.
Right.
Because you can't just sit down and chat with them for a little bit, which is how you build that relationship.
Exactly.
But Mark, there's something interesting going on here, though, which is COVID is breaking the relationship between Washington insiders and Washington policymakers. Because Washington insiders are insiders because they can get in people's offices and talk to them, which they can't do.
Right.
What I think is happening, which is kind of cool, is that the playing field between Washington insiders and regular people is leveling.
Right.
Because regular people can still make phone calls, and they can still do calls, and they can still send emails, which is what we can do now. And frankly, local legislative offices, your senator's office in your local cities and towns, are still functioning. And what we found is that our folks in the districts can get into meetings. Now, they can't always do face-to-face meetings, but they can do phone calls, they can do conference calls, they can exchange emails with local staffers much easier than we can do it here in Washington, which means the regular people, the scientists and engineers that are engaging their elected leaders, actually have better access in some cases than we do here in Washington now. And so COVID is actually strengthening the political assets we have as professions, making it easier for us to work with legislators, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, very interesting. And as you point out too, Russ, this is very much like refueling the plane in flight. So many things are yet to be determined, but this process has to be moving forward at the same time. You touched on this too, but I just wonder if there are additional comments that you might have. Just your central principles for your own advocacy approach and how you've seen it develop over the years that you've been doing this.
So the basic fundamental assumption that I make when I do what IEEE-USA does, and it's a little simplified, but I think it's broadly true, is that there are two groups of people. Let me rephrase that. There's two types of voices that politicians hear. There are voters, and then there's noise. And that fundamentally, almost everything policymakers do, members of Congress, elected types do, is about figuring out what the voters want them to do and then doing it and making sure the voters know about it. And everything else is just noise. Now, that's not entirely true. I mean, there's friends and there's funders and there's political allies, and so there's some other voices that still count. But fundamentally, the reason democracies work so well, and despite all the cynicism of our age, it's very difficult to argue that democracies in our current world are less effective than everything else. Because if you look at the free, the wealthy, the safe societies, they're all democracies. So the reason democracy works so well is because it does put the regular person, the voter, at the center of the process. And then everything else is just the politicians trying to figure out what those voters want. So you start with that assumption that everything's about the voter. Now, how do we get the voters to be effective advocates? How can you play that role? And there are two, there's actually three, but there's two that matter rules in my book for being an effective advocate. First, you have to speak up. Second, you have to do it again. And third, don't be a jerk when you do it.
Right.
And I really think it's that simple. Washington insiders like to talk about, many folks sell themselves to non-political folks as being an expert because we know the inside scoop. We know the secret paths. We know the phone calls. We know who to, we have some secret set of information that makes us effective advocates. And the fact is, you and I, we do know people and we do know how to get things done and we kind of do know the rules. But the reality is, to be a good advocate, you don't have to do that. You just have to speak up. And if you do that and then do that again, you will be listened to. Now, the trick here, though, is you have to do the speaking. In other words, most policymakers, and this is going from president all the way down to city council, most elected officials spend most of their day getting yelled at. 1,000 people want them to do 1,000 different things. And you, as the elected official, the best you can do on a good day is make some sense of the noise. The last thing you're going to want to do is go find new people who aren't currently yelling at you and get them to yell at you. Which means if we want them to listen to us, we have to go to them. We have to take the first step and probably the second and third step. But when you do that and do it in a sincere way, even if you don't get it exactly right, even if there's some typos in your email or you stumble a little bit on the phone call, they're still going to pay attention to you. They're still going to listen. And if you do that consistently over time, you'll be effective more often than not. And, IEEE members have been doing this around the country, and we have some great examples of just folks just made a phone call and said, hey, we want to meet with you, and had a successful meeting. And it is surprising to many people how easy it can be sometimes. Sometimes it's hard, but sometimes it can be very easy just because you took that first step.
Right. Right. And you're a constituent, like you pointed out, you're a voter.
Exactly.
And you're automatically a VIP. Yeah, absolutely. I remember I did this keynote at UNC Chapel Hill, and somebody raised their hand during the questions and said, I don't know if I can advocate. I only have an hour a week to do it. And I said, if you were to spend an hour a week talking to your elected officials, you would be among the 0.5% of people in that district, who are active. Therefore, you'd be really prominent. Your voice would definitely resonate. People in that operation would know who you are. Yeah. It's a significant amount of time, even though it doesn't seem. And he could do it from his couch in this example for this person
Mark,
who asked.
One of the things I tell my members is only about 10% of the American public will interact with the political system in any way other than voting. You send one email, that's 5 minutes of your time, you're in the top 10% most powerful advocates in the country.
Yeah, it's pretty important. So important as you strike to be involved. I'm going to ask you as we wrap up, Russ. You have been involved on so many different fascinating policy areas. You talked about quantum computing a little bit, and AI. And I'm just wondering if you just take maybe two of those. I know our audience is interested in autonomous vehicles. We're all sort of wondering, what's going to happen there, and maybe digital privacy, since that's been that is so salient, particularly these days. What IEEE-USA's priorities are for shaping policy on these issues, and maybe how you see things unfolding in the future. Of course, no one has a crystal ball, but you're an expert, and these are policy interests of IEEE-USA. So I think your perspectives would really be valuable to folks.
Well, there's two interesting issues to pick, because there's some similarities, but also some stark differences. Both issues are being driven by technology and technological innovation. In other words, policymakers are going to have to do something on both of them, just because tech is getting away from them if they don't. In the case of autonomous vehicles, it's purely engineering and science. We are getting better at building computers that can think, and they're thinking more and doing more. And so we're going to have an autonomous vehicle, and then the question is just what to do with it before too long. Pardon me a second. phone is ringing. Digital privacy technology has driven the issue, but it is, at this point, I think, primarily kind of a normative question. We know what tech can do. We know what the tech companies can do. Now we need to debate what we want to allow them to do.
Right.
Which is not a technical question. It's a societal question.
Right. It gets back to what you were saying earlier, and it's so true. I think maybe part of this whole thing too was that people had no idea what was going on. So then and there's a new documentary out now too. A lot of information's come out clearly after the 2016 election. So people sort of got educated. Now the issue is, okay, what are we going to do about it? So those will be fascinating to watch as they unfold.
Absolutely.
Well,
so I can go into a little more detail on what's going on in both of those.
Sure.
Autonomous vehicles, there is a bill called the Drive Act, which starts to position the federal government. See, I think in both cases, Congress, Washington, D.C., are at a point where they're just starting to try to tackle these issues. They've been talking about them and researching them and thinking about them for a number of years, and they're just starting to get to the point where they can do something about it. Autonomous vehicles, it's the Drive Act, which has been around for about 4 years. When it was introduced, it was very forward thinking and very kind of ahead of the curve. And then they didn't pass it. Now the curve's caught up. And so now it's a little behind the times. But we're hearing that that's going to be a priority next year, simply because it has to be. I mean, companies are going to start putting autonomous vehicles on the road. And if the regulations and the laws don't catch up, that's just bad. So they're going to have to do it. Digital privacy is kind of in the same place. Legislators have been making a lot of noise. They've been talking about a lot of things and kind of talking around the issue, all of which is a normal part of the process of policymakers getting their heads around the issue. What we're hearing is policymakers are starting to settle into positions and they're starting to decide things. Now, the difference is on autonomous vehicles, the approach is very bipartisan. There are some differences between the states, but they're not dramatic. And so there's different blocks, but they tend to be bipartisan and bicameral. So the path forward is a little more clear. Digital privacy is becoming more partisan. But what's interesting is both the Republicans and Democrats are carving out positions that put them against the tech companies, but they're against them in different ways, which makes it impossible for them to do anything at the moment, which is not helpful. But again, I think digital privacy, just life is taking over for Congress. And they're going to, what's happening is we have GDPR, this big law in Congress, in Europe, that is controlling what a lot of American companies have to do on privacy. You have a California privacy law and a couple other states that have passed privacy laws, which are not consistent. And that just can't work. You can't have 50 privacy laws governing the tech companies. And so Congress is going to have to step in sooner rather than later. And IEEE-USA is already working with legislators kind of to start we're not at the point where we're crafting legislation, but helping to clarify their thinking on these issues so they're ready to do something more aggressively next Congress.
So important. Well, Russ Harrison, you have seen a lot. You continue to be, at the forefront of these really exciting technologies that we were talking about a little bit just now. I really appreciate you coming on the show as Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA, quarter century of experience. Really appreciate your insights and perspectives today.
And Mark, we appreciate what you're doing. This is an important conversation to have, and I'm just thrilled to be part of it. Thank you.
Thanks for that. And listeners, thank you for being here on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to click subscribe. Check us out on the web at whensciencespeaks.com, and we'll see you next time.